On a rain-soaked night at Putney Bridge, a solitary woman paced back and forth, intentionally letting water weigh down her heavy skirts before plunging into the freezing Thames. She was not shackled by guards, but her spirit was suffocated by betrayal and the brutal prejudices of her era. This jump was not merely a search for an end, but the desperate escape of a human being driven to the edge for daring to live with wild, unapologetic freedom. Her crime was neither murder nor treason, but daring to use a razor-sharp pen to demand equality in a world that required women to be silent and submissive. She was a brilliant philosopher spat upon by society as a hyena in petticoats, simply because her intellect and courage far outstripped the men of her time. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft, and her death stands as painful proof of the brutal price a pioneer is forced to pay. London, 1759. The world was ablaze with the Age of Enlightenment, a time when men like Rousseau and Voltaire were passionately championing liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet amidst this intellectual revolution, there remained a silent, glaring contradiction. These rights applied exclusively to men. For a woman of the 18th century, life was not a pursuit of freedom, but a confinement within a legal and social cage designed by the very men celebrating liberty. Under the suffocating law of coverture, a woman was essentially property, first of her father, then of her husband. The moment she said "I do," she ceased to exist in the eyes of the law, losing all rights to her property, her earnings, and even her own children. Society reinforced this erasure by educating girls solely to be pleasing accomplishments, rather than rational thinkers. As the era's leading philosophers argued, a woman's highest purpose was merely to please and to be subjugated. Her mind deemed too fragile for the weight of reason. She was expected to be silent, delicate, and subservient, a permanent child in a man's world. But into this oppressive atmosphere was born a figure who would refuse to fit the mold. This was the unforgiving world that greeted Mary Wollstonecraft. It was a system built to keep her down, yet she would rise to dismantle it, armed with the very weapon men claimed she did not possess, a brilliant and rebellious mind. She was born on April 27, 1759, in Spitalfields, London. On paper, the family should have been comfortable. Her paternal grandfather had been a master silk weaver, a successful and wealthy London craftsman who left behind a substantial inheritance. But her father, Edward John Wollstonecraft, was a man of grand, gentlemanly ambitions and disastrous, catastrophic judgment. He was, to put it simply, a failure who resented the world and his family for it. Edward was restless, vain, and incompetent. He despised the trade that had built his family's fortune and was determined to live as a gentleman farmer, a project for which he had zero talent. He dragged his growing family from London to Essex, to a farm near Barking, then to another near Yorkshire, always chasing the next failed venture, hemorrhaging the family fortune with every single move. The Wollstonecrafts were a family in a state of perpetual, anxious decline. But Edward's financial incompetence was the least of his vices. He was also a violent, abusive alcoholic. Mary's childhood was not one of drawing rooms and gentle lessons. It was a battlefield, governed by the sound of her father's drunken footsteps on the stairs, the tension of a home waiting for the next explosion. And at the passive center of this storm was Mary's mother, Elizabeth Dixon Wollstonecraft. Mary, sensitive and intense, craved her mother's affection, her protection, her validation. But Elizabeth was a broken woman beaten into a state of chronic submission. She had no affection to spare, and what little she had she directed, not at her brilliant, difficult daughters, Mary, Eliza, and Everina, but at the eldest son, Edward, or Ned. Ned was the golden boy. He, and only he, was the one who mattered. He was the heir, the future, the man. He was the only child given a formal education, sent to a proper school to be trained as a lawyer. Mary, meanwhile, had to fight for scraps of knowledge. She was taught to read and write at a local day school, but her real education came from the books she read in secret, and the bitter daily lesson in the privilege of the male playing out before her very eyes. It was here, in the cold shadow of her brother's opportunity and her mother's indifference, that the first sparks of her famous indignation were lit. She was seeing in her own home the very system that Rousseau would later praise. The boy was educated for the world, the girls for his convenience. But the most searing memories came at night, as her father's rages escalated, aimed squarely at her mother. The young Mary, not yet even a teenager, would take it upon herself to be the family's sole protector. She would lie down on the cold floor of the landing, a small trembling barrier outside her mother's bedroom door, hoping to absorb the blows, to hear the first sign of trouble, or at least to buy her mother a few moments of peace with her own small presence. She was a child, forced to be the only adult in the room. This experience forged her in fire. It did not make her weak, it made her iron. It instilled in her a profound, visceral hatred of tyranny in all its forms, whether it was a king over his people, a master over his slave, or a husband over his wife. She learned in the most brutal way possible that the domestic and the political were not separate. The same power that made her father a tyrant in his own home was the power the law gave to all husbands, and it gave her an ironclad resolve. She would be independent. She would find a way to earn her own money, to live by her own mind. She would never, ever be at the mercy of a man like her father. When her mother died in 1782, Mary felt little grief, only a cold sense of release. She wrote of her mother with a chilling finality. I felt no pang, for she had lost in the mother, the friend. The ties were cut. At the unheard-of age of 19, she had already done what few women of her station dared. She left home to make her own way. Her life of struggle and her life of revolution had officially begun. For a respectable middle-class woman in 1778 with no money, no connections, and no husband, the options were bleak. They were, in fact, a list of prisons. You could be a servant, a seamstress, or, if you were educated enough, you could enter one of the two forms of genteel servitude, a governess to rich children or a lady's companion. Mary chose the latter, taking a job with a wealthy, demanding widow, a Mrs. Dawson, in the fashionable resort town of Bath. She hated it. She hated the insipid conversation, the frivolous pastimes, and the soul-crushing emptiness of her role. She was, in her own words, a mere machine. She was expected to be an empty vessel, a polite echo, a breathing decoration. For a mind as sharp and hungry as Mary's, it was a form of intellectual starvation. She left the post to care for her dying mother, but her personal life was about to provide her with both her greatest love and her first great tragedy. In her late teens, Mary had formed the most significant friendship of her life with a young woman named Fanny Blood. Fanny was everything Mary was not: gentle, artistic, accomplished, and, on the surface, demure. But beneath, she was trapped by the same forces. Her father, like Mary's, was a lazy, drunken fellow who had failed in business, and Fanny was desperately trying to support her own family with her painting and needlework. In Fanny, Mary found her intellectual equal and her emotional anchor. They were, in many ways, each other's first true love. Their letters are intense, passionate, and full of a shared intellectual and emotional world. They read together, they criticized each other's writing, they debated philosophy. It was in comparing her own raw, unpolished writing to Fanny's more elegant style that Mary first felt the sharp sting of her own defective education. This realization didn't make her quit. It made her double down, pushing herself to read philosophy, history, and literature with a new ferocity. Together, they dreamed a radical, romantic dream. They imagined a life where they could live together, support themselves with their own talents, and be free from the tyranny of men and family. They dreamed of a room of their own, a small house where they could live and work in a sisterly partnership, a utopia of female friendship and intellectual labor. In 1784, this dream took a radical concrete form. Mary, having returned from her mother's deathbed and staged a dramatic, borderline illegal rescue of her sister Eliza from a likely abusive marriage, decided to act. Mary, her sisters Eliza and Everina, and their beloved Fanny Blood pooled their meager resources and opened a school for girls in Newington Green. This wasn't just any school, and Newington Green wasn't just any suburb. It was a buzzing, pulsing hive of radical thought. It was the heart of the dissenters, the intellectuals, Unitarians, and preachers who rejected the authority of the state-run Anglican Church and, by extension, the absolute power of the monarchy. Because they were barred from respectable universities like Oxford and Cambridge, the dissenters had created their own dissenting academies, which were, at the time, the most intellectually vibrant and progressive institutions in England. Here, in Newington Green, Mary wasn't seen as a difficult woman. She was seen as a brilliant mind. She was, for the first time, home. She fell under the intellectual spell of the community's leader, the dissenting minister and moral philosopher Dr. Richard Price. Price was a giant of the 18th century thought. A fierce defender of the American Revolution, he was a close friend of Benjamin Franklin, and a believer in the power of human reason to perfect society. Attending his sermons, Mary's raw personal anger at the injustices she'd faced, her father's abuse, her brother's privilege, the vacuity of Mrs. Dawson, began to crystallize. Price gave her the philosophical language to understand her own experience. Her personal suffering wasn't just personal, it was political. Her hatred of domestic tyranny was no different from Price's hatred of political tyranny. She was, for the first time in her life, in her element, an intellectual among equals. This brief, idyllic period of intellectual bliss was, however, built on a fragile foundation. The school was always in financial trouble, but the real blow came from the person Mary loved most. Her dearest friend, Fanny Blood, whose health had always been fragile, was now suffering from the advanced stages of consumption, tuberculosis. In a desperate bid for a different life and perhaps to escape the burden of her own family, Fanny accepted a marriage proposal from Hugh Skeys, a man she had previously rejected. She would marry him and move to Lisbon, Portugal, hoping the warmer climate would save her. Mary was devastated. She saw the marriage as a betrayal of their dream, a mortal blow. She felt abandoned. It got worse. In 1785, Mary received word that Fanny, now in Lisbon, was pregnant and gravely ill. Mary did not hesitate. She abandoned the school, her only source of income, her entire life's work, and borrowed money to take a stormy, harrowing sea passage to Lisbon. She arrived just in time. The scene was one of pure Gothic horror. Fanny had given birth, but the child was weak, and Fanny herself was dying. Mary Wollstonecraft arrived in a foreign country, alone, just in time to hold her dearest friend in her arms as she died. The baby died shortly after. Mary was shattered. The emotional center of her world was gone. The woman who had been her anchor, her intellectual partner, and her first love was dead, a victim of the very system they had tried to escape, forced into a marriage for security, killed by a body weakened by poverty and childbirth. Adrift, broke, and drowning in grief, Mary eventually returned to England. The school at Newington Green, which she had abandoned, had failed in her absence. Her sisters, who had relied on her, were furious. She was in debt. She had lost her friend, her home, her dream, and her only source of income. She was 26 years old and she had failed at everything. Every attempt to live an independent, respectable life had blown up in her face. The dream of a room of her own was dead, buried with Fanny in a grave in Lisbon. The death of Fanny Blood was not just a personal tragedy. It was the shattering of Mary's first great dream. The utopia of female independence she had tried to build at Newington Green had collapsed into grief and debt, proving that friendship and hard work were not enough to survive in a world that offered women no solid ground. At 26, grieving, broke, and having failed in her first attempt at a new genus of life, Mary was forced back into the very cage she had tried to escape. She had to find respectable work, and for a woman of her class and intellect, there was only one genteel prison left: the role of the governess. This next chapter, born of desperation, would provide the very fuel for her future fury. When Mary Wollstonecraft returned from Lisbon in the winter of 1785, she was not just grieving, she was destitute. The woman who had held her dying friend in her arms was now 26 years old, in debt from her journey, and utterly without prospects. The school at Newington Green, the great utopian experiment of female independence, had collapsed in her absence. Her sisters, who had depended on her, were resentful and angry. She had lost her friend, her community, her income, and her dream. She was forced once again to seek one of the few respectable prisons available to a woman of her class. She had to take the one job she despised above all others, that of a governess. This time, her post was in Ireland, with the aristocratic Kingsborough family. If her previous post with Mrs. Dawson had been a form of genteel servitude, this was a year-long front-row seat at the very heart of the system she was beginning to despise. The Kingsboroughs were part of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, fabulously wealthy, and in Mary's eyes, fabulously corrupt. Her employer, Lady Kingsborough, became the living embodiment of everything Mary saw as wrong with women. She was, as Mary wrote, a frivolous, tyrannical woman, obsessed with her own beauty, her lapdogs, and the endless, vapid rituals of aristocratic life. She was a woman who lived for pleasure, treating her own children as little more than fashionable accessories, to be shown off at parties, and then handed back to the staff. Mary's time in their lavish, cold household was a year of profound misery, but also of profound intellectual clarity. This wasn't just a bad job, it was field research. She was not just teaching the Kingsborough daughters, she was observing firsthand the systematic destruction of the female mind. She saw how these girls were rendered weak and wretched by an education designed entirely to make them pleasing. They were taught to suppress their intellects, to cultivate a false sensibility, and to focus all their energy on the art of pleasing in order to secure a wealthy husband. She wrote in a letter that she had entered a new world, a world of dissipation and folly, where the affections were tossed out of the window in exchange for a little lackluster, temporary liberality, which is only a disguise of vulgarity. Mary, with her fierce intellect and raw Republican sensibilities, was a ticking bomb in this environment. She was too smart, too opinionated, and too disdainful of her employers to last. Lady Kingsborough, who likely sensed Mary's silent, burning judgment, found her difficult. After only a year, Mary was unceremoniously dismissed. She was 28 years old. She was jobless, and she had now failed at every single respectable profession open to a woman. She had failed as a companion. She had failed as a schoolmistress. And now she had failed as a governess. She was, by the standards of her time, a complete and total failure. She was out of options. And so, standing on the precipice of her own ruin, she made a decision that was, for the 18th century, as radical as sailing to the moon. She would not return to her abusive father's home. She would not become a dependent relative. She would not hunt for a husband. She would move to London alone with a manuscript she had written in Ireland, an essay on female education born of her frustrations titled Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. She was not going to be a companion, a governess, or a wife. She was going to be an author. She famously wrote to her sister, "I am going to be the first of a new genus. I am determined." She would live by her pen, or she would starve in the attempt. Mary's new genus began in 1787 with an introduction to a man who would not just change her life, but, in many ways, make it. His name was Joseph Johnson. Johnson was not a typical publisher. He was a dissenter, a progressive, a key figure in London's radical intellectual scene. His shop at St. Paul's Churchyard was not just a bookstore. It was the central meeting place, the Republican salon, for the most forward-thinking minds of the day. It was where thinkers, poets, and revolutionaries gathered. Johnson was a man who took risks. He published abolitionist tracts, scientific texts, and the works of poets like William Blake and William Cowper. He was, in short, one of the only men in England who, upon meeting a difficult, intense, and astonishingly brilliant 28-year-old woman with a manuscript, would see not a problem, but a mind. Johnson published her thoughts on the education of daughters, and her first novel, Mary, a fiction, a thinly veiled melancholy tribute to her lost friend, Fanny Blood. But he offered her something far more valuable than a book deal. He offered her a home, an education, and a job. He gave her steady work, translating texts from French and German, languages she had largely taught herself. And most importantly, he hired her as a staff writer and literary reviewer for his new liberal magazine, the Analytical Review. This was it. This was the key that unlocked the cage. Mary Wollstonecraft was at last a professional. She was a woman of letters. She was earning her own living by her own mind. She moved to a small house near his shop, and Johnson's circle became her circle. At Johnson's famous weekly dinners, she wasn't the governess, the poor relation, or the hysterical woman. She was an equal. She was there to argue. She sat late into the night debating politics, art, and philosophy with the greatest minds of the day. Men like the anarchist philosopher William Godwin, whom she initially disliked, finding him cold and pedantic, the Swiss-born artist Henry Fuseli, and the revolutionary firebrand himself, the man who had helped ignite the American Revolution, Thomas Paine. Imagine the scene. This young woman with her defective education holding her own, arguing fiercely, and impressing them all with the raw power and passion of her intellect. This was her true university. In the pages of the Analytical Review, she became a formidable literary critic, reviewing hundreds of books on every subject, sharpening her own ideas, and developing her distinct, muscular prose style. Joseph Johnson became her mentor, her friend, her banker. He even helped her sort out her father's disastrous finances and provided support for her sisters. Their relationship was so close, so supportive, that gossips whispered they were secretly married. He was, in essence, the stable, supportive, encouraging father she had always craved and never had. She was independent. She was respected. She had found her new genus. And in 1789, the world exploded. The French Revolution was a political earthquake that shattered the foundations of the 18th century. When the Bastille fell in Paris, the English establishment was terrified. To them, this wasn't liberation. It was the mob run amok, the end of civilization. In 1790, the great conservative philosopher and parliamentarian Edmund Burke published his pamphlet Reflections on the Revolution in France. It was a passionate, eloquent, and thunderous defense of tradition, aristocracy, and the monarchy. He famously and sentimentally lamented the fall of the French queen, Marie Antoinette, writing, "I thought 10,000 swords must have leaped from their scabbards to avenge even a look that threatened her with insult, but the age of chivalry is gone." The book was the talk of London, a runaway bestseller that defined the conservative position. Mary Wollstonecraft read it, and she was disgusted. To her, Burke's chivalry was a flowery justification for oppression. His sentimental defense of the Queen was a pathetic, privileged blindness to the real, unsentimental suffering of the poor and the starving. His defense of tradition was nothing more than a defense of the very tyranny she had hated her entire life, the tyranny of the musty old laws that gave a father power over his daughter, a husband over his wife, and a king over his people. While other radicals in Johnson's circle planned their measured academic responses, Mary acted. In a white-hot fury, she grabbed a pen. She wrote in a fever, so fast that the printer could barely keep up, sending her pages to the press as she finished them. In just 28 days, her reply was on the streets. She published it anonymously at first. A Vindication of the Rights of Men was a broadside. It was the first of what would be nearly 50 rebuttals to Burke, and it was by far the most savage. She didn't just disagree with Burke, she tore him apart. She attacked him, not as a political opponent, but as a man. She called his arguments sentimental, effeminate, and absurd. She savaged his theatrical pity for Marie Antoinette, contrasting it with the very real, very brutal poverty of the French masses. She wrote, "Your tears are reserved for the declaiming hero or the beauteous queen, not for the low-born vulgar. Misery to reach your heart must have its cap and bells." She savaged the aristocracy, the rotten privilege of inheritance, and the very idea that laws should be respected simply because they were old. It was a deeply personal, deeply Republican, and deeply angry book. When the pamphlet sold out and went to a second edition, she did something even more shocking. She put her name on it, Mary Wollstonecraft, a woman. The book was a sensation. A woman had jumped, uninvited, into the most important political debate of the century and had, by all accounts, drawn blood from the most respected philosopher in England. Suddenly, she wasn't just a reviewer. She was one of the most famous and infamous political writers in the country. But she was just getting started. She had taken on the rights of men. Now, she would take on the rights of her own sex. In 1792, in another feverish 6-week burst of inspiration, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote the book that would define her life, her legacy, and, in many ways, the next 2 centuries of thought. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. This book is even today a staggering piece of work. Its core argument is simple, yet it was so revolutionary that it struck the 18th century mind like a thunderbolt. "I do not wish women to have power over men," she wrote in one of its most famous passages, "but over themselves." Her argument, which she laid out with methodical, passionate, and often furious logic, was this: women are not naturally inferior to men. They only appear to be weak, frivolous, irrational, and obsessed with sensibility because they are denied an education. They are, she argued, kept in a state of perpetual childhood and treated as spaniel-like creatures, good for nothing but pleasing their masters. She took direct aim at the Enlightenment's own darling, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. She acknowledged his genius, but she eviscerated his philosophy on women. His idea that a woman like Sophie should only be educated to please her Emile was, to Wollstonecraft, the very root of the problem. This, she argued, turned women into slaves in their own homes, intoxicated by the follies of fashion and romance. It not only made them bad wives, incapable of being true companions to their husbands, but it made them terrible mothers, unable to raise rational, virtuous Republican children. The solution? A revolution in education. She called for equal educational opportunities for boys and girls. She didn't just mean better female education in accomplishments. She meant the same education. She demanded they be taught logic, philosophy, science, and mathematics. She even suggested they be educated together in a national public school system, a truly scandalous and unheard of idea. Only through this rational education, she argued, could women achieve independence of mind. Only then could they become rational creatures and free citizens. But she didn't stop at education. In passages that were almost futuristic, she went on to demand full civil liberties. She argued for women's right to work, to enter professions like medicine, nursing, and business, and to own their own property. And in one stunning, almost offhand remark, she argued that if women were to be subject to laws, they should have a voice in making them, calling for women to be represented in government, a clear, early, and unambiguous call for the right to vote, a full century before the suffragist movement would begin. And then she attacked the sacred institution of marriage. A marriage without love, she said, a marriage based on financial security or convenience, rather than a true rational fellowship between equals, was nothing more than legal prostitution. This was the bomb. The book exploded onto the public scene. It was debated in salons, it was praised by radicals, and it was violently attacked by conservatives. The press, shocked and titillated, didn't know what to do with her. Horace Walpole, a prominent writer, famously dismissed her as a hyena in petticoats. Mary Wollstonecraft had, at 33 years old, become the most dangerous and celebrated woman in Europe. She had written the founding text of modern feminism. She had also, in her personal life, just fallen into a passionate, obsessive, and ultimately disastrous love affair. While she was writing her great treatise on reason, her own sensibility was in open revolt. She had become infatuated with the artist Henry Fuseli, a married man in Johnson's circle. It was not a physical affair, but an intense, intellectual, and on her part, obsessive infatuation. She was captivated by his genius and his dark, brooding persona. He, in turn, was flattered by her attention, but had no intention of leaving his wife. Mary, in a move that demonstrated the profound chaotic disconnect between her philosophy and her heart, made a shocking proposal. She suggested that she, the champion of reason, move in with Fuseli and his wife so that they could all live together in a purely platonic, intellectual ménage à trois. Fuseli's wife Sophia was, unsurprisingly, horrified. She rejected the proposal and forbade Mary from ever seeing her husband again. Mary was left utterly heartbroken and deeply, publicly humiliated. She had just argued to the entire world for a new world governed by female reason. Now her own life was completely overwhelmed by the very sensibility she had denounced. She was a walking, breathing contradiction. She needed to escape. She needed to escape London, to escape Fuseli, to escape the humiliation. At 33, Mary Wollstonecraft had achieved the impossible. She had published The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, making her the most formidable and dangerous philosophical mind in Europe. She had, with pure, ferocious reason, built a blueprint for female liberation. But the apostle of reason was, in her private life, a woman undone by passion. Her humiliating, obsessive infatuation with the married Henry Fuseli and its disastrous public rejection left her in a state of profound crisis. She was a walking contradiction, and she needed to escape. She had to flee the scene of her humiliation and the London society that now saw her as a hyena. She chose the one place on earth as volatile, as revolutionary, and as contradictory as her own mind. Paris, at the very height of the French Revolution's blood-soaked terror. When Mary Wollstonecraft arrived in Paris in December 1792, she was a woman in flight. She was fleeing the humiliation of her unrequited obsessive love for Henry Fuseli. She was fleeing a London society that now viewed her as the scandalous hyena in petticoats, and she was in many ways fleeing her own chaotic heart. She, the great champion of reason, had been made a fool of by sensibility. She sought refuge in the one place on earth that seemed to mirror her own internal revolutionary state. She crossed the channel to become a direct witness to the future. She went to observe firsthand the great human experiment she had so fiercely defended in her Vindication of the Rights of Men. What she found was not a shining republic of reason. It was a city descending into a paranoid bloodbath. Mary arrived just in time to see the end of the monarchy. The king, Louis XVI, was already imprisoned. His trial was the talk of the city, and the air was not filled with the joyous cries of liberty, but with the barbarous howls for blood. The September massacres, where over 1,000 prisoners had been dragged from their cells and butchered by frenzied mobs, had just concluded. The cobblestones were barely clean. Her spoken French was poor, her connections few. She was at first terribly isolated. She took a room in a large, mostly empty hotel, and the reality of the violence began to press in on her. She wrote to her publisher, Joseph Johnson, about one nightmarish experience. She had just seen the king being taken in his coach to his trial. The mood in the streets electric, with a violence that chilled her to the bone. She wrote, "I have seen eyes glare through a glass door opposite my chair, and bloody hands shook at me. I'm going to bed, and for the first time in my life I cannot put out the candle." This was the humanist in her, the part that had always been more real than the abstract revolutionary. She had championed the revolution from afar, but the reality on the ground was terrifying. She quickly fell in with the more moderate political faction, the Girondins, who, like her, were in favor of a republic, but were horrified by the escalating indiscriminate violence of the radical Jacobins and their leader, Robespierre. This was a dangerous association. Soon, the Girondins she admired, like the eloquent Madame Roland, would be rounded up and sent to the guillotine. The reign of terror was beginning. It was in this atmosphere of profound terror, political chaos, and personal isolation that she met him. His name was Gilbert Imlay. To Mary, he must have seemed like a character from a novel, a figure of pure, uncomplicated deliverance. He was everything the grim, bloody-minded Jacobins were not. He was an American, a natural man from the new, successful republic. He was a dashing adventurer, a former soldier in the American Revolutionary War, a timber merchant, and even an author. His novel, The Emigrants, celebrated the pastoral, natural life of the American frontier, a perfect echo of the Rousseauian ideals Mary's circle admired, but stripped of Rousseau's misogyny. He was handsome, charming, confident, and seemed to share her modern views on love and freedom. He was the Émile to her Sophie, but an equal, a partner. They were two English-speaking radicals, free from the constraints of conventional society in the most revolutionary city on earth. Mary fell for him hard. She fell with all the desperate, stored-up passion she had poured into her work, all the desperate, unfulfilled longing for affection that her childhood had denied her and the Fuseli affair had cruelly exposed. They began a passionate affair. For Mary, this was not just a romance, it was a philosophical statement. This was the rational fellowship she had written about. This was what love should be, a free and equal partnership, uncorrupted by the legal prostitution of marriage. They would be a new genus of couple, just as she was a new genus of woman. Then, in February 1793, everything changed. Britain and France declared war. Suddenly, Mary Wollstonecraft was no longer a visiting intellectual. She was an enemy alien. Her English friends were fleeing the city. Those who stayed, like her hero Thomas Paine, were being arrested. Paine himself would be imprisoned and narrowly escape the guillotine. She was in real, mortal danger. Imlay, as an American, was safe. He was a citizen of a neutral, allied republic. And so, to protect her, he took her to the American embassy and registered her as his wife. The irony was staggering. Mary Wollstonecraft, the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, the woman who had savaged marriage as a form of slavery, was now Mrs. Imlay. She was, in effect, his property. It was a legal fiction, a shield to save her life, but it was also a chain. They moved to a small secluded house in Neuilly-sur-Seine, just outside the city, to escape the surveillance and the daily executions of the terror. And it was here, in this rented cottage, that Mary experienced what was perhaps the only period of pure, unadulterated happiness in her entire life. In the spring of 1794, she gave birth to their daughter. She named her Fanny in honor of her long-lost friend. Mary was ecstatic. She was, at last, a mother. She adored the child. Her letters from this period are overflowing with a new, profound joy. She wrote of the exquisite pleasure of nursing her baby, of the newborn tenderness that had awakened in her. She finally had what she had always craved, not the abusive, cold patriarchy of her father's house, but a true family of her own, built on principles of love, reason, and equality. But Gilbert Imlay was not the man she thought he was. He was not the natural man or the rational fellow. He was, at his core, a speculator, a philanderer, and a man who was easily bored. Almost as soon as the baby was born, Imlay's business interests began to call. He was a timber merchant, but he was also involved in far more speculative and likely illegal wartime smuggling and blockade running. His business took him away to Le Havre and then to London. At first, his absence was just an ache, but then his letters became infrequent, short, and cold. The Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, was the apostle of reason. The Mary Wollstonecraft who wrote the letters to Imlay is a different person entirely. The letters, which were later published, are one of the most heartbreaking chronicles of an emotional unraveling ever put to paper. The champion of reason was completely and pathologically overwhelmed by sensibility. We can trace her descent through her own words. First came the anxiety and the gentle, pained reminders of the rational love they shared. She wrote to him in Le Havre, "When I am thus sad, I sigh with a physical sadness, which is strongly contrasted with the sublime tranquility of my mind. Come to me, write, or come." Then, as his silence deepened, came the pleading. The independent woman was now a beggar. She wrote, "My friend, my best friend, I am very low. It is you who must save me. I am not, I will not be, merely a friend to you. I am your wife, am I not?" She, who had written the blueprint for female independence, was now defining her entire existence by this one man. She was becoming the very spaniel-like creature she had so famously denounced, and she knew it. This was the tragedy. Her rational mind was a helpless, horrified passenger, watching as her emotional self tore her life apart. She wrote of this love as a viper in her bosom, a corroding poison. She could see what was happening, but she was powerless to stop it. "My affections have been turned back on myself," she wrote, "and I have felt all their bitterness." Imlay, for his part, was simply gone. He was back in London, enjoying his new business-funded lifestyle, and had already taken up with a new lover, a young actress. Mary, devastated, obsessed, and in denial, made her next move. The terror was over. Robespierre had been executed in July 1794, but Paris was a wasteland. She resolved to follow him. In April 1795, she took her infant daughter Fanny and returned to London. She found Imlay. She confronted him. He did not deny his infidelity. He was cold. He was distant. He made it clear in no uncertain terms that the affair was over. For Mary, this was not just a breakup. It was an annihilation. It was the collapse of her entire world. She was a single mother. She was a fallen woman in the eyes of the law. The child she adored, Fanny, was illegitimate. The social stigma was crushing, absolute. She had built her entire life, her entire philosophy, on the gamble of this one rational love, and she had lost. The woman who had survived her father's tyranny, who had built a career from nothing, who had intellectually savaged Edmund Burke, and who had stared down the French Revolution, was now, in her own mind, nothing more than a jilted mistress. In her despair, Mary Wollstonecraft attempted suicide for the first time. She went to her lodgings, alone. She wrote a final desperate note to Imlay. "I would have been a good mother. I have done my duty. Let my wrong sleep with me. I shall stamp welcome on the bosom of death." She took a dose of laudanum, an opium tincture. She lay down expecting to die. We don't know the exact details, but Imlay, perhaps receiving her note and realizing the severity of the situation, was alerted. He either came himself or sent someone. A doctor was called. Her stomach was pumped. She was, against her will, saved. She awoke to a new kind of horror. She had failed even at this. Imlay, the man of business, now had a very serious problem on his hands. A publicly suicidal, famously intellectual, and deeply wronged ex-lover was not good for his reputation or his new relationship. He was, as she later wrote, terribly alarmed by her actions. He needed to get rid of her, but he also, it seems, genuinely needed her help. He was a speculator, and one of his biggest speculations had just gone disastrously wrong. He had been involved in a complex scheme to smuggle valuable goods, including silver and other valuables, out of France and into a neutral country. He had purchased a treasure ship in Norway, but his own agent, a man named Elias Bachman, had essentially stolen the ship and its cargo. The legal situation was a tangled international mess. Imlay, the dashing adventurer, was a coward. He couldn't or wouldn't go to Scandinavia himself to sort it out, but he needed an agent, someone he could trust, someone with legal authority to act on his behalf. And so, in a move of almost unbelievable cynicism and manipulation, he proposed a solution. He asked Mary to go. He asked her, the woman who had just tried to kill herself over him, the mother of his 1-year-old child, to travel to the remote, unfamiliar, and potentially dangerous coasts of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. She would go as Mrs. Imlay, using the legal authority of the name he had given her at the embassy in Paris. She would carry a power of attorney, and her mission was to negotiate complex shipping deals, confront the thieving agent, and reclaim his stolen property. It was an insane, dangerous, and bizarre mission for anyone, let alone a woman alone with a 1-year-old child and her nursemaid Marguerite in 1795. A rational person would have refused. A rational person would have seen it as the desperate, manipulative ploy of a guilty man trying to get his inconvenient family out of the country. But Mary Wollstonecraft was no longer governed by reason. She was a drowning woman, and he had just thrown her the thinnest, most rotten sliver of a rope. She agreed. Why? Her letters make it tragically clear. She convinced herself that this was not a banishment, but a test. It was a grand gesture of loyalty. She would be his business partner. She would prove her rational utility, her fortitude, her masculine strength of mind. And by completing this impossible mission, by saving his fortune, she would win him back. He would see her, not as the weeping, sensible creature she had become, but as the strong, rational companion he had first fallen in love with. She clung to this hope. It was all she had left. In June 1795, Mary Wollstonecraft, her infant daughter Fanny, and her nurse boarded a ship bound for Sweden. She was not a philosopher on this journey. She was a woman on a desperate, hopeless quest, sailing toward an even greater darkness. Gilbert Imlay had broken her. The rational fellowship she had gambled her entire life on had proven to be a cruel sham, ending in infidelity, abandonment, and a desperate, laudanum-soaked suicide attempt. Yet in a final, cynical act of manipulation, Imlay offered her one last rotten sliver of hope. He asked the woman he had just destroyed to become his business agent, to embark on an insane and dangerous mission to Scandinavia to reclaim his stolen fortune. A rational mind would have refused, but Mary, clinging to the thinnest, most pathetic possibility of reconciliation, agreed. This journey, a bizarre, unprecedented expedition for a lone woman and her child, would be her final desperate attempt to prove her utility and win back the man who had already discarded her. Mary Wollstonecraft's journey to Scandinavia in the summer of 1795 was one of the strangest, most dangerous, and most modern expeditions of the 18th century. Here was a woman known throughout Europe as a radical philosopher, now traveling under the thin cover of Mrs. Imlay. She was a single mother with a 1-year-old child, Fanny, and a nursemaid Marguerite in tow. She was not on a grand tour to admire art. She was on a high-stakes solo business mission, plunged into the complex, male-dominated world of international shipping, chasing a stolen treasure ship for the man who had already broken her heart. Her journey took her from the bustling port of Gothenburg, Sweden, through the rocky, remote coasts of Norway, to Copenhagen, and finally to Hamburg. It was an arduous, lonely, and often perilous trip. She was traveling by sea and by land, in carriages over rough roads, staying in basic, uncomfortable inns. She was a curiosity, a woman, clearly intelligent, asking sharp, specific questions about contracts, cargo, and a runaway sea captain. And she was, it turned out, remarkably good at it. The same masculine, rational mind that had deconstructed Edmund Burke now applied itself to Imlay's tangled finances. She was, as she had promised, a partner. She met with merchants, lawyers, and officials. She tracked down Imlay's rogue agent, Elias Bachman, and confronted him. She navigated the complex legalities of the stolen ship, and while she couldn't recover the entire fortune, it was too late, the cargo had been sold off, she successfully salvaged a significant portion of Imlay's assets through sheer force of will and intellect. She had proven her rational worth. She had done the impossible. But her private journey, the one chronicled in the letters she was sending back to Imlay, was a steady descent into hell. With every letter she sent, detailing her business progress, her loneliness, her melancholy observations on the Scandinavian people, her desperate, aching love for him, she was met with a deeper, colder silence. The thin sliver of hope she had clung to, that this grand gesture would win him back, was dying. She wrote to him from Sweden, "I am weary of traveling, yet I cannot rest. I have you not to fly to, and my spirits are worn out. I am a prey to a devouring melancholy, which I vainly struggle to shake off." The replies she received, when they came at all, were short, impersonal, and evasive. He was not just indifferent, he was annoyed. He was a man in London enjoying a new life with his new mistress, and these anguished, brilliant letters from Scandinavia were a vexation. The truth finally, irrevocably landed. He had not sent her to Scandinavia to test her loyalty. He had sent her to get rid of her. He had used her mind, her legal name, and her desperation to solve his financial problems for him. She was not his partner. She was his dupe. She wrote with a new icy clarity, "You have completely broken my heart. I have been and am the most miserable of women." She had completed her business. Her grand gesture was a finished bitter failure. She made her way back to London via Hamburg in the fall of 1795. The last flickering ember of hope was that she could confront him, see him, and what? She didn't even know. She arrived in England. She learned definitively that he was living with the actress. He was gone. It was over. The last 9 months, the hope, the mission, the journey, had all been a grotesque, cruel farce. The champion of reason had nothing left to live for. The perpetual childhood of sensibility, which she had fought so hard to warn other women against, had claimed her completely. She went to Putney Bridge in London. It was a cold, dark, rainy October night. She was, as she later wrote, determined to plunge into the depths of my despair. But this was Mary Wollstonecraft. Even her suicide attempt was a rational, methodical act. She paced the bridge in the driving rain. This was not a chaotic impulse, but a calculation. She walked until her clothes were heavy enough to ensure she would sink, preventing any chance of an unwanted rescue. When she was certain of the weight, she climbed onto the railing and jumped into the black, freezing, fast-moving water of the Thames. It was, as she would later describe it, one of the most calm and rational acts of my life. The violent physical shock of the cold water was, she said, a relief, and she felt nothing more. She lost consciousness, sinking into a peaceful sleep. She should have died. By every right, she was dead. But a group of boatmen passing by in the dark had seen something, a shape, a fall. They rowed over to the spot. They saw a body in the water, hooked it, and pulled her unconscious, waterlogged form from the river. They brought her to the bank, to a nearby pub, the Swan Inn. They worked to resuscitate her. They forced the water from her lungs. Mary Wollstonecraft had, for the second time, failed to die. The woman who emerged from the icy dark waters of the Thames in October 1795 was not the same person who had jumped. The Mrs. Imlay, who had been a creature of sensibility, a spaniel-like woman, to use her own harsh term, living for the approval of a man, was dead. That part of her had been scoured away, baptized in the freezing, polluted water. The person who survived, who had been so calm and rational in her decision to die, was now Mary Wollstonecraft, the philosopher, reborn. She was done with Gilbert Imlay. She wrote him one final chillingly calm letter, not to plead, but to dismiss. "I have only to say that I am dead and gone," she wrote, a ghost sealing her own tomb. "I part with you in peace." She was 36 years old, a notorious public figure, a single mother with an illegitimate child, Fanny, and utterly broke. She returned to the only true, stable man she had ever known, her publisher and surrogate father, Joseph Johnson. He has always welcomed her back. He gave her a home, he gave her work, and he encouraged her to write again. She began to reassemble her life, piece by painstaking piece. She took the journals and letters from her disastrous, harrowing trip to Scandinavia, and in an act of supreme intellectual alchemy, transformed her trauma into art. The resulting book, Letters Written, during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, published in 1796, was a profound fusion of her two selves. It was a sharp, rational analysis of Scandinavian society and a sublime, melancholy meditation on nature and a broken heart. The book was a sensation, her most popular work, and it captivated one reader in particular, her old intellectual sparring partner, the philosopher William Godwin. William Godwin was in many ways Mary's male equivalent. He was the father of anarchism, the high priest of pure, cold reason. His 1793 book, An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, was a foundational text of radical thought. In it, he argued for a society based on absolute reason, one that would see all human institutions, especially government, religion, and most famously marriage, abolished. To Godwin, marriage was the worst of all properties, a fraud, and a form of slavery. He argued it was a corrupt contract that forced two people to stay together even after utility and fellowship had ended. A rational person, he argued, would never chain themselves in such a way. He and Mary had met before in 1791 at one of Joseph Johnson's famous dinners. They had, by all accounts, hated each other. Godwin had gone to the dinner specifically to hear the great Thomas Paine speak. But Mary, fresh from the success of her vindication of the rights of men, had dominated the conversation, arguing fiercely with Paine. Godwin, a man who preferred calm, logical discourse, left in a huff, annoyed by this difficult and opinionated woman. But when they were reintroduced in 1796, everything was different. Godwin was a man in awe. He had just read Letters from Sweden. He had expected to meet the scandalous Mrs. Imlay, the hyena in petticoats. Instead, as he wrote, he had read a book that calculated to make a man in love with its author. He saw past the gossip and found a woman of profound feeling, sublime intellect, and a deep human melancholy that resonated with his own. They fell in love, but this was not the desperate, fiery, all-consuming viper of passion that Mary had felt for Imlay. This was not the obsessive intellectual infatuation she had felt for Fuseli. This was something new. This was, at last, the rational fellowship she had written about her entire life. It was a meeting of minds. They were two of the most famous and radical thinkers in London, and they embarked on a relationship that was as unconventional, rational, and modern as their philosophies. They were lovers, but they were determined to maintain their precious independence. In a truly radical arrangement, they took separate, adjoining houses in a neighborhood called Somerstown. They would work alone in their own studies during the day, focusing on their own writing. They would not intrude on each other. They would often communicate by notes delivered by servants, a runner carrying philosophical arguments and lovers' messages the few yards between their front doors. Then in the evenings they would meet as equals for conversation, for dinner, and for love. It was, for Mary, the intellectual and emotional equality she had always dreamed of, but never, ever found. She was happy. She was stable. She was, perhaps for the first in her life, truly at peace. In the winter of 1797, their perfect, rational, radical experiment hit a very traditional, very human complication. Mary became pregnant. This presented a profound moral and philosophical crisis, not for Mary, but for William Godwin. Godwin was the man who had publicly and repeatedly argued against the tyranny of marriage. His entire reputation as a philosopher was built on his commitment to pure, abstract reason over corrupt social conventions. Mary, however, was a woman who had lived the consequences of that abstract philosophy. She had already suffered the devastating, crushing social stigma of having an illegitimate child. She was Mrs. Imlay, a fallen woman, a social outcast. Her first daughter, Fanny, carried that stigma with her every single day. Mary had seen firsthand what the world did to women and children who dared to live outside the protection of a man's name. Her lived female experience was about to collide with his abstract male philosophy, and her experience, born of fire and water, was the stronger. She could not subject this new child to the same fate. Godwin, the great philosopher, was trapped. He could stick to his pure principles, and in doing so, doom his lover and his unborn child to a life of public shame. Or he could sacrifice his philosophical purity, betray his own stated beliefs, and do the practical, human-loving thing. He chose Mary. On March 29, 1797, in a quiet, almost secret ceremony at St. Pancras Church, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft married. The fallout was immediate. Their conservative enemies were delighted. They pointed and jeered, "See, even the great anarchist, the great hyena in petticoats, must bend to convention. Their radical philosophy was just a cover for promiscuity." And in the end, they came crawling back to the altar like everyone else. Their radical friends were in many ways even more brutal. They were furious. They saw Godwin as a hypocrite, a traitor who had abandoned the great cause of reason for a mere woman. The man who had written the Bible of anarchism was now just another husband. Godwin and Mary were isolated, but they were together. They maintained their Somerstown arrangement, still keeping their separate houses to work, but they were now, legally and publicly, a family. For the next 5 months, Mary was, by all accounts, truly happy. She was in a stable, loving partnership with her intellectual equal. She was correcting the proofs for Godwin's new book, and she was writing her most radical, most furious novel yet. It was to be called Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman. This was not the optimistic educational tract of A Vindication. This was a dark, gothic, and furious exploration of the reality of female oppression. The book's thesis was that women across all social classes, from the aristocratic Maria, locked in a private insane asylum by her abusive husband, to the working-class Jemima, the brutalized asylum keeper, were all prisoners in a vast, male-run gulag. It was a novel that, for the first time, explored a woman's right to her own sexual desires, something so radical it wouldn't be spoken of again for a century. She was at the peak of her intellectual powers. She was loved, she was safe, and she was about to give birth to their child. On August 30th, 1797, Mary went into labor. It was long, over 20 hours, and difficult, but she was attended by a midwife. At 11:20 p.m., she gave birth to a healthy baby girl. They named her Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. This child, the baby Mary died to birth, would one day become Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. The birth was a success. William Godwin was ecstatic, but the ordeal was not over. The placenta broke apart during the delivery and was not fully removed. This was a common, and in the 18th century, a deadly complication. A doctor, a Mr. Poignant, was called. He had to reach into Mary's uterus to manually remove the remaining pieces. It was an agonizing, invasive, and, most critically, an unsterile procedure. This was 1797. The concept of germ theory was a century away. Doctors and midwives did not wash their hands. The instruments were not clean. In the days that followed, Mary grew feverish. infection set in. It was puerperal fever or septicemia, blood poisoning. It was the scourge of 18th century childbirth, the number one killer of new mothers. Godwin, the man of pure reason, became frantic. He was helpless, watching the woman he adored, the only person who had ever met him on his own intellectual and emotional plane, begin to die. He brought in the best doctors in London. Their cures were medieval. They applied poultices. They bled her. At one point, in a truly Gothic, horrifying attempt, they placed live wriggling puppies on her abdomen, believing the animal warmth would draw out the putridity of the infection. For 10 days, Mary fought. She was, as Godwin wrote in his heartbreaking minute-by-minute journal, inconceivably calm, lucid, and courageous. She was not afraid of death. She had met it twice before, but she was worried. She worried about Godwin, about her little Fanny, about the new baby. She whispered to her husband, "Godwin, I know what you are thinking," trying to comfort him. The infection was relentless. Her body, which had survived her father, survived poverty, survived the reign of terror, and survived the Thames, could not survive this. On the morning of September 10th, 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft died. She was only 38 years old. William Godwin, the man who had argued that all emotion was a betrayal of reason, was destroyed by a grief so profound it unmade him. He had found his perfect, rational partner, only to have her stolen from him by a random septic and agonizing tragedy. In the depths of his grief, William Godwin decided to do what he did best. He would write. He would write a tribute to his late wife, a biography that would cement her reputation as the genius he knew her to be. He would show the world the brilliant, complex human woman he had loved. In 1798, he published memoirs of the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It was, without question, the single greatest disaster to ever happen to Mary Wollstonecraft's legacy. Godwin, in his naive, philosophical, and almost fanatical commitment to rational truth, wrote with a devastating and artless honesty. He held nothing back. He believed that to vindicate her, he had to tell the whole truth, to hide nothing, as truth was the ultimate good. He told the world everything. He wrote about her brutal, abusive childhood. He wrote about her passionate, intellectual, and obsessive love for the married artist, Henry Fuseli. He wrote about her passionate sexual affair with Gilbert Imlay. He wrote in plain terms about the birth of her illegitimate daughter, Fanny. And, most shockingly of all, he wrote in detail about her 2 suicide attempts, the laudanum overdose and the leap from Putney Bridge. To the conservative reactionary society of 1798, a society terrified by the immoral chaos of the French Revolution, this wasn't a biography. It was a confession. It was a moral outrage. It was, to them, pornography. Godwin had intended to paint a portrait of a complex, brilliant, and courageous human being. Instead, he had handed her enemies all the ammunition they would ever need for a century. The backlash was immediate, brutal, and total. Her enemies no longer had to argue with her ideas. Her vindication was a dense, logical, and difficult book to refute. Now, they didn't have to. They could just attack her life, which Godwin himself had just served up to them on a platter. Mary Wollstonecraft was no longer seen as a serious philosopher. She was instantly rebranded. The Anti-Jacobin Review, the leading conservative paper, called her a prostitute, a concubine, and a whore. They called Godwin's memoirs a convenient textbook for harlots. She was a hyena in petticoats, an unnatural woman, a philosophical strumpet. Her vindication was dismissed as the dangerous, insane raving of a morally bankrupt, sex-obsessed woman who had rightly been driven to suicide. Her reputation was not just damaged, it was murdered. Godwin, in trying to build her a monument of truth, had buried her. For nearly 100 years, Mary Wollstonecraft's name was mud. Her books went out of print. Her ideas were silenced. To be a Wollstonecraftian was to be a promiscuous, home-wrecking, unwomanly revolutionary. The mother of feminism had been, in effect, excommunicated by the very society she tried to save. The tragedy echoed in blood through her own family. Her first daughter, Fanny Imlay, grew up in the Godwin household, a quiet, melancholy girl, living in the shadow of her mother's public scandal and her brilliant, favored new half-sister. In 1816, at the age of 22, Fanny, like her mother, fell into despair. She traveled to an inn in Wales, checked in under a false name, and died by suicide, taking an overdose of laudanum. Her second daughter, however, would carry the flame. This was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, the baby she died to birth. This young woman, who grew up reading her mother's books and her father's philosophy, would elope with a radical poet named Percy Bysshe Shelley. And one stormy night in Switzerland, she would sit down to write a story. Her name was Mary Shelley, and her novel was Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The daughter, just like the mother, had created a new genus of literature, and her work, like her mother's, explored the tragedy of a monster, a creature of profound feeling and intelligence, shunned, feared, and cast out by a society that refuses to understand it. For a century, Mary Wollstonecraft remained a hyena, but ideas are harder to kill than people. In the late 19th and early 20th century, as women began to organize, as they began to fight for the right to own property, the right to an education, and, most radically, the right to vote, they went looking for a history. They went looking for their intellectual ancestors, and they found Mary. The suffragists like Millicent Garrett Fawcett in Britain and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in America rediscovered a vindication of the rights of woman. They brushed off the century of dust and scandal, and they found preserved inside the intellectual dynamite they had been searching for. They saw her not as a fallen woman, but as a pioneer, a prophet who had spoken the truth 100 years too soon. They reclaimed her. They republished her work. They held her up as the founder of their movement. Virginia Woolf in the 20th century would look back at Mary's life of struggle, her fight to live by her pen, her demand for a room of one's own, and see her as the mother of us all. Today, Mary Wollstonecraft's legacy is what she always intended it to be. She is not a tragic, lovesick character from a novel. She is one of the most important philosophers of the modern age. Her Vindication is not a scandal. It is a foundational text of human rights. Her core arguments that women's minds are as capable as men's, that education is the key to liberation, and that a society that holds back half its population can never be truly enlightened, are no longer revolutionary. They are, in much of the world, self-evident. Mary Wollstonecraft's life was, in many ways, a profound contradiction. She was the apostle of reason who was ruled by her heart. She was the champion of independence who nearly died for a man who abandoned her. But this isn't a failure of her philosophy. It is proof of her humanity. She didn't just write about the oppression of women. She lived it. She felt the sting of unequal education in her own family. She knew the powerlessness of being financially dependent. She knew the soul-crushing humiliation of being a governess. She knew the desperation of a woman left to face the world alone. Her philosophy was not born in a quiet, academic library. It was forged in the fire of her own experience, in the violence of her childhood home, in the misery of the governess's chair, in the despair of her affair with Imlay, and in the dark, cold, rational decision she made on Putney Bridge. Mary Wollstonecraft demanded a world where women would not be destroyed by their emotions, not because they didn't have them, but because their minds would be strong enough to be their guide. She fought for a world where a woman's worth was not tied to her husband or her beauty, but to her intellect and her character. She did not live to see that world, but she laid the first stone. She was, just as she had promised, the first of a new genus. And we, all of us, are living in the world she helped to build.